Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Zachary Strong, and I'm an engineering physics graduate who became a scholar of philosophy, psychology, and neuroscience. And today I'm going to be blending all of those topics together to show you that certain virtues and morals can be derived from the laws of physics, and specifically the laws of thermodynamics or energy transfer. Okay? So in this video, I'm going to start out by reviewing some things that Friedrich Nietzsche said about 150 years ago. Particularly, he mentioned God is dead, and he's also famous for saying long live physics. So I'm going to start by reviewing what he actually said and putting that in context. And then we're going to move into some physics and neuroscience, where I'm going to talk about how physics and neuroscience give us a very interesting and kind of final viewpoint on topics of morality, virtue, good, and evil. So, without further ado, let's just jump into it. We're going to start out with the famous quote of Nietzsche, God is dead. So, people kind of take this God is dead thing and they kind of leave it at that, like, oh, God is dead, right? But the full quote is a lot more revealing about what Nietzsche was actually saying. Okay? People think that God is dead is a comment on metaphysics and like whether or not God actually exists. But it's not really that. It's more of a comment on ethics and morality. So here's how the passage actually goes. And it's from The Joyful Science. Where has God gone? He cried. I shall tell you. We have killed him, you and I. We are his murderers. But how have we done this? How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What did we do when we unchained the earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving now? Away from all suns? Are we not perpetually falling? Backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there any up or down left? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is it not more and more night coming on all the time? Must not lanterns be lit in the morning? Do we not hear anything yet of the noise of the gravediggers who are burying God? Do we not smell anything yet of God's decomposition? Gods too decompose. God is dead. God remains dead. And we have killed him. How shall we, murderers of all murderers, console ourselves? That which was the holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet possessed has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? With what water could we purify ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we need to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we not ourselves become gods simply to be worthy of it? There has never been a greater deed, and whosoever shall be born after us, for the sake of this deed, he shall be part of a higher history than all history hitherto. So that's the full quote in context. Nietzsche he's not just making a comment on metaphysics, he's making a comment on the chaos that will come from the collapse of the Christian worldview. Okay, and that was happening during his time, partially because of Darwin and evolution and so on. Nietzsche sensed that people weren't as invested in biblical metaphysics as they used to be. And what he's really saying here is that with the collapse of biblical metaphysics comes the collapse of ethics, biblical ethics. Okay? So before modern science, people had a view of, there's God, God creates morality, and that morality is, basically imposed or expected of humans. Okay, so God creates morality. Morality, is you could say imposed on humans. Okay? However, after modern science, which was when Nietzsche was active, there's just humans. Okay? There's, in his view, if you are an atheist or you leave behind the Christian metaphysics, you don't have God creating morality. It's just you and the universe. Okay? So where does the morality come from? Okay? And that's what Nietzsche is saying in this quote is basically, okay, so if we don't believe in God anymore, where does the morality come from? Okay? And I actually had a discussion with a number of other people a couple weeks ago, and I brought this up to them and I said, okay, so if people don't believe in a God, morality is just a social construct. It's just a social convenience. Okay? Because if there's no objective morality that comes from a creator, okay, what is moral is just a matter of agreement between me and other people. And whoever is most powerful sets the morality. Which is why postmodernism, which is partially based on Nietzsche, postmodernism talks all about power. Okay? It's all about power, this, and like social norms and power and blah, blah, blah. And why? Because in the absence of a creator that creates morality and humans, whoever is most powerful sets what morality is. Okay, and our world today is kind of operating under that presupposition. Okay, lots of time and energy and money is spent on elections and politics and so on, and activism and whatever. And why? Because morality is right now, it's become a social construct. And you have different social groups who are trying to get themselves elected so they can set what morality is. Now, here's the problem. Morality is not a social construct. It's not a social construct. And, later on in the video, I'll talk about how we can derive virtues and morality from the laws of physics. However, what we're going to do right now is review another one of Nietzsche's famous quotes, which is, "Long live physics." Which, to be honest, I quite like this quote because I'm an engineering physics graduate. So, long live physics. It's nice to get the shout out. But let's dive into the quote. "We, however, want to become who we are, the new, unique, incomparable ones, who give themselves their own laws, who create themselves. And to that end, we must become the best learners and discoverers of everything that is lawful and necessary in the world. We must become physicists in order to be able to be creators in this sense. While hitherto all valuations and ideals have been based on ignorance of physics, or were constructed so as to contradict it. Therefore, long live physics, and even more so that which compels us to turn to physics, our honesty." Okay, so this is also from The Joyful Science. And so what Nietzsche is saying here is, okay, so if we are leaving behind Christian metaphysics and also Christian morality, now we need to look to science, and particularly physics. We need to look to science and physics in order to figure out what our values, morals, and ideals should be. Okay, so essentially in The Joyful Science, Nietzsche says God is dead, which is recognizing that people are letting go of biblical metaphysics and ethics, and he's proposing a replacement, which is the laws of science and the laws of physics. Okay? Now, interestingly, over the last 50, 60 years, we've made certain discoveries within physics. And as I'm about to show you, those discoveries lead to certain virtues and morals as being somewhat self-evident. Okay, and so I think this is really interesting because even though there was no way for Nietzsche to really know this at the time, he was absolutely correct in saying that the laws of physics are going to allow us to create our own values, virtues, and morals. Okay, and so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to dive into the physics of virtue. Okay, it turns out that certain virtues can be derived from the laws of physics. Now, in order to do this, we have to begin with two axioms, which are self-evident. Okay, in philosophy, you're supposed to try to avoid axioms as much as possible. However, these two are self-evident. Okay, the first self-evident axiom is that it is better to live than to die, And the second self-evident axiom is it's better to live well than to live in misery. As far as I can tell, these are unassailable. You can't argue with these. These are two principles that you can't argue with. Okay, and I'll tell you why. If you want to argue with me that it's better to die than to live, the very fact that you are alive and arguing with me is a performative contradiction. Okay, the very fact that you are alive choosing to argue with me that it's better to die, it's a performative contradiction, and therefore your argument is inadmissible. Okay, if you really thought it was better to die than to live, then you wouldn't even be alive arguing with me. Okay, so any argument against this axiom is a performative contradiction and therefore inadmissible. Also, if you want to step to me and tell me that it's better to live in misery than to live well, that is also a performative contradiction. Because my reply to you will be, okay, give me all your money, give me everything you own, and come be my slave. And you'll say, well, I don't want to give you all my money, I don't want to be your slave. And it's like, okay, so clearly you think that living well is better than being my chattel. Okay, so that's also a performative contradiction. Okay, so anyone that wants to come to me and argue that it's better to live in misery than to live well is offering an inadmissible argument by way of performative contradiction. Okay, the only people I will accept an argument from are people who have agreed to give me everything they own and become my slave. Okay? So these two axioms are self-evident. If you are alive and arguing with me, okay, it's a performative contradiction and your argument is inadmissible. Okay, so with that necessary groundwork, laid, we can now move to the laws of physics and how they allow us to derive certain virtues. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to start out with the mathematical theory of communication. In 1948, the early days of digital computing, engineers at Bell Labs realized that information is subject to the same laws of physics as energy and entropy. And essentially, information is analogous to entropy. Okay, and I'm not going to go into all the explanation in this video. I cover it in other videos on my channel. However, essentially, information is a form of surprise. If you are getting information, okay, it's something new to your brain, it's something surprising. And the more surprising something is, the more information it offers you. Okay? So, for example, if you're driving down the road and everything is working fine, there's not a lot of surprise there. Okay? But let's say something is going wrong with your engine. Suddenly you're driving down the highway and smoke starts coming out of your engine. It's like, okay, this is surprising. I've learned something about how my engine is working. Okay? So information is surprise. And that's just the laws of physics. Now, based on this groundbreaking work, over the last 20 years, a neuroscientist named Karl Friston has deduced that the brain is essentially a computer that acts to minimize surprise. The brain doesn't like to be surprised, and therefore it works primarily to reduce surprise coming from its senses. Okay? So for example, let's say you are walking through the jungle and you're hunting, I don't know, like monkeys or something, right? You're trying to get yourself a monkey or a pheasant or something. You're walking through the jungle. Let's say a jaguar jumps out at you. That's very surprising. Okay? And usually surprises are bad. There can be good surprises, but often surprise is bad. Surprise means danger. Okay? And so your brain is wired to minimize surprise as much as possible. Now on the screen, I've included a diagram here. Basically, in the top right-hand corner, your brain is in a reciprocal relationship with the environment. Okay, the environment gives your senses, information. Your senses give that to the brain processes it. And in the bottom, this is a mathematical representation of surprise minimization. Over time, your brain works to minimize surprise. Okay, so the two graphs start out very different, then they become closer and closer. And that's a mathematical representation of your brain trying to minimize surprise. Okay, so now, based on all of this, okay, we can define a virtue as a pattern of behavior that promotes living well. And then we can say, if the human brain is designed to minimize surprise, what are personal qualities that would allow someone to minimize surprise and be most effective in adapting to their environment? Okay, so if it's better to live well than to live in misery, and our brain is designed to minimize surprise, what are personal qualities somebody needs to have in order to accomplish that? Okay, and here are 3 examples. Honesty, being able to admit that you are receiving surprising information, even when it is disruptive to your current worldview. Courage, being willing to think about things that are scary, inconvenient, or shame-inducing. And third, curiosity, being oriented towards your environment and eager to adapt to it. Those are 3 virtues that, we define them as intellectual virtues. But these 3 things can be derived logically from physics. Okay? Will to live, like your will to live well, plus the laws of physics and the neuroscience based on it, combine, and it's like, okay, honesty, courage, and curiosity. These things can be derived. They can be derived from physics. Okay? So that's a quick look at the physics of virtue. Okay? Now what we're going to do is we're going to move into the physics of good and evil. Okay, so good is typically defined as good behavior, relative to your social group, and evil is generally defined as doing bad or mean things to your social group. But if we aren't looking at the Bible to figure out what's good and evil, can we use the laws of physics to figure out what might be good and what might be evil? Okay? So in order to do this, we have to add a third self-evident axiom, which is, it is better to have social harmony than civil war. Now, if you want to argue with me that it's better to have civil war, you had better be instigating civil war. Okay? Because if you're choosing to live in peace and you want to step to me and make an argument that civil war is better, either you're a coward or it's a performative contradiction. Okay? Or both. Okay? So if you are not actively involved in a civil war right now, you aren't able to make that argument to me, and your argument is inadmissible by way of performative contradiction. Okay, so now that we're all on the same page that it's better to have social harmony, we need to think about what that entails from the laws of physics. So a couple of years ago, I had some email exchanges with Karl Friston, and he let me know about a paper that he was working on called Federated Influence and Belief Sharing. So from the abstract of the paper, this paper concerns the distributed intelligence or federated influence that emerges under belief sharing among agents who share a common world and world model. Imagine, for example, several animals keeping a lookout for predators. Their collective surveillance rests upon being able to communicate their beliefs about what they see among themselves. And so Karl Friston and his fellow researchers are now moving from a single brain model to multiple brain models. Okay? What happens when you have multiple surprise-reducing brains operating in a group? And essentially, they use communication in order to reduce surprise for themselves, within the group, and for the group. Okay? The fundamental mechanism that's being used here is surprise minimization. And so if you want to minimize surprise in a social group, first, you don't want to be that surprised by the other members of your group. Okay, so intra-group surprise needs to be minimized. Okay, because if there's 5 people in a group and one person is off on a tangent doing something surprising, it creates surprise for the group. Okay, and we want to minimize that, which we call social harmony. And also, the group, as a group, wants to minimize surprise for itself from external sources. For example, predators or so on. Okay, so we in social groups use communication in order to minimize surprise, both within each other and for the group as a whole. And so based on this, I've got a concept which I think I've invented it, which is called social entropy. Okay? In social environments, a human being doing something troublesome or unexpected creates more entropy than if they were behaving harmoniously. Therefore, a chaotic or disordered society contains a lot of entropy, and a harmonious or well-ordered society contains less entropy. The practical understanding of this is that if a social group has a lot of conflict, disorder, or confusion, members of that group have to process more information. Okay, there's more surprise coming in. If everyone's off doing their own thing, surprising each other, each brain in the social group has to spend a lot of time processing what the heck everyone else is doing. Okay? So the implication, as I mentioned, is the more surprise people create for each other, the more time and energy people have to devote to merely existing in the social group. And so the general rule here is that we don't want to be creating surprise for each other. And based on that rule, which is derived from the laws of physics, we can conclude that things like assault, murder, theft, deceit, and corruption are evil, objectively evil. And why? Because all of these things force people to expend lots of time and energy on maintaining their own safety. Okay? Because if I am trapped in a society that is full of assault, full of murder, full of theft, deceit, corruption, just general nastiness, I can't trust anyone else. Okay? I have to spend a lot of time and a lot of energy verifying that I can trust people. Okay? For example, in business, the only reason contracts exist is to minimize threat. Okay? You might have, if you're in business or you talk to business people who are like baby boomers or older, they'll say, oh yeah, like we used to be able to do deals on a handshake. We can't do that anymore. And why? Immorality, deceit, and corruption. Okay? Everything in business now requires an extensive contract. Requires. Okay? It doesn't actually require that. Because if you're an honorable person and you know someone else is honorable, you could just shake hands and proceed. Okay? And to be honest, that's how I prefer doing business. Okay? And, you know, currently, like my current job, that's how it operates. We basically shook hands. I'm working for him. He's trustworthy. I'm trustworthy. So we don't need extensive contracts, extensive lawyers, or whatever. And if we ever want to renegotiate something, we just sit and talk about it and come to a shared reality of what we want to happen. Okay? Whereas in other situations, people have to sign extensive performance contracts and blah, blah, blah. And, it, you know, lawyers and HR are involved, and it creates a lot of, you know, time and energy spent. Okay? Whereas if you're able to do a deal on a handshake, you don't need HR. You don't need legal. You don't need all of these other professionals which are designed to reduce threat and improve safety. Okay? So basically, that is a practical example of how social entropy creates inefficiency. Okay? Thousands and thousands of dollars spent on lawyers, thousands and thousands of dollars spent on HR. Technically, you don't need HR. Technically, you don't need unions. Okay? Unions only exist because management and frontline workers are not able to sit down and come to a reasonable agreement together. Okay, and a practical example of that is I'm from Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. We're known as the Steel City. Okay, and up until a decade or so ago, there were two major steel mills in Hamilton. Okay, one is DeFasco, the other is Stelco. Stelco went out of business because unions and the management kept clashing. They were creating so much inefficiency that the company ended up fumbling and going under. Okay, and then no one had a job. Okay, that's what happened to Stelco. DeFasco, not unionized. They actually refused the union. They took a vote on it about a decade ago, and DeFasco refused the union. And why? Because management and workers are able to sit and talk and come to reasonable conclusions together. Okay? And that creates efficiency. Okay? Because workers don't have to pay union dues. They have more in their pocket. Okay? All the thousands spent on legal and blah, blah, blah. Like, it's just more efficient, which is why DeFasco is still in business and Stelco is dead. Okay, so those are some of my rants on social entropy. Now, those rants illustrate something which I call carrying capacity, which is a term I borrowed from biology. People have a finite amount of capacity to process information. Groups and societies are collections of individuals and also have a finite amount of capacity. If a social group contains more entropy than people can handle, it breaks down into chaos. Okay? Civil war. Stelco going under. Cities, dying and becoming unsafe, and so on. These are all examples of when social entropy exceeds the carrying capacity of the society. And so all of this can be derived from the laws of physics. And what I find interesting is it shows us that regardless of what we want to be true, regardless of what we wish was true, certain virtues and elements of morality are baked into the laws of physics. They are baked into the laws of physics. They are unavoidable and unescapable. Okay? Things like honesty, courage, curiosity, not murdering, not stealing, not lying, not being corrupt. Okay? These things are baked into the laws of physics. And therefore we can conclude that, at least to some extent, morality is not a social construct. Regardless of whether or not you believe in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, morality is not a social construct. Morality is real. Virtues are real. And it's very, very unfortunate that our society has veered in such a way where we are ignoring these things. Okay, because if you go to any university and you talk to their ignorant professors, okay, they will tell you, oh, morality is just a social construct. There's no such thing as morality. Okay, and I've been in discussions with people who say the same thing. Oh, like, morality's not real. It's just, a social agreement. 9, as Nietzsche would say. 9, 9, 9, 9, 9, 9, 9. Morality is real. We must turn to physics. We must turn to physics in order to discover this.